The affair Miss Marple could never forget. A Miss Marple Mystery. Welcome back to Detective Notebook, my friends. I'm Jane, and it truly warms my heart to see you joining me again this evening. I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Did you have a peaceful day? Share it in the comments, and remember to subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Letter from the Past. The evening had begun like so many others in St. Mary Mead, with the scent of wood smoke curling gently from cottage chimneys and the faint chime of the church clock drifting through the still air. Miss Marple sat by her window, the lamplight soft upon her knitting, while outside autumn leaves swirled across the cobblestones in slow, graceful circles. It was the kind of evening that invited reflection, a quiet pause between the day's small routines, and the hush of night. On the little table beside her stood a teacup, gone cool in a stack of neatly written correspondence. She had meant to answer one of them, perhaps the vicar's wife or her niece in London. But her attention kept returning to the letter lying apart from the rest, an old envelope, its edges yellowed, its handwriting unmistakably familiar in its slant and flourish. It was not the letter of the day, nor even of the decade. It had arrived that afternoon, carried by the village postman, who'd raised his cap with the mild curiosity of one who delivers gossip as much as mail. Miss Marple had opened it slowly, with the same care one might use to lift a fragile memory. Now, as the lamplight flickered, she unfolded the paper again and read each line in silence. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the words seemed alive still, alive with the weight of something unspoken. At the bottom, just before the signature, rested a single pressed violet, brittle with age. She held it between her fingers, and in that instant the years folded away like pages turned too quickly. Her gaze grew distant. She was no longer the silver-haired lady by the fire, but the young Jane Marple of long ago, standing at the edge of a grand ballroom lit by 100 candles. Music swelled from a distant orchestra, violins weaving through laughter and whispers. She could almost smell the roses, the perfume of youth and expectation. The Fairley Ball of 1910, it had been the talk of every county newspaper. Silks rustled, jewels sparkled, and beneath all the glitter lay the quiet heartbeat of scandal. She remembered the Fairley family in their splendour. Lord Fairley, charming and proud, his wife Eleanor, delicate as glass, and the tutor, Jonathan Gray, whose quick smile and gentle manner had caused more than one young lady to blush behind her fan. He had vanished that very night, as suddenly as a candle snuffed out. A search had been made, of course, but nothing ever came of it. The matter had faded into whispers, then into silence. Miss Marple drew a steady breath. The letter was signed in a hand she hadn't seen since those days. Eleanor Fairley. The name alone seemed to stir the air around her. Yet Eleanor had died nearly 20 years ago, hadn't she? The thought made Miss Marple's knitting fall unnoticed to her lap. She read the final line once more. He was never truly gone. The fire crackled softly, as if aware of her unease. She folded the letter and placed it beside the violet. Outside, the wind rose, brushing through the trees with a sigh that sounded almost like a voice calling her name. For a moment, she sat very still. The room seemed smaller, the shadows deeper. Somewhere in the village a dog barked once and fell silent. Miss Marple lifted her chin, the spark of resolve returning to her eyes. She had promised herself never to think of that night again, never to untangle the web of sorrow and guilt it had spun. But fate, it seemed, had its own ideas. With a quiet motion, she reached for the lamp and turned up the flame. The light grew steadier, brighter. Whatever truth waited behind that letter, she would face it once more. The rain had begun in earnest, tapping insistently against the window panes and drumming on the roof like a soft but urgent summons. Inside, Miss Marple had set aside the violet and letter, pouring herself another cup of tea, trying to calm the stirrings of memory and unease that the envelope had awakened. The flickering lamplight danced across her knitting needles and the lace curtains, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. She was not alone in feeling the chill of the evening air. The village, wrapped in mist, appeared as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then came a knock at the door, polite, deliberate, and persistent. Miss Marple glanced up, her mind flickering between curiosity and caution. Visitors at this hour were rare, and in all her years in St. Mary Mead, few were urgent enough to brave the rain with purpose. She rose slowly, pulling her shawl about her shoulders, and crossed the room. Upon opening the door, she was greeted by a familiar, steady presence. Inspector Craddock, his coat damp from the downpour, held in one hand a folded newspaper clipping. His expression, calm yet unmistakably serious, spoke more than words ever could. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying the faint echo of years of friendship. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I thought you might wish to see this immediately." She took the clipping from him, noting the headline, "Mysterious Death Discovered at Fairley House." The article was brief, reporting that the body of a man had been found in one of the old servant quarters, an unmarked death, seemingly forgotten by time and suddenly resurfaced. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she traced the printed words, feeling an old, familiar knot of unease. The name Jonathan Gray appeared at the bottom of the report, though some details were frustratingly vague. Craddock's eyes met hers. "I thought perhaps you might remember something from long ago. Something the rest of us would never know." "You were there, Miss Marple. You knew them." The implication hung in the air, heavier than the rain itself. Her memories, once carefully tucked away like fragile treasures, surged forward. The Fairley ball, the vanished tutor, the whispered promises, the secret glances across candlelit halls. They all returned with an immediacy that made her heart quicken. The past, she realized, was no longer a distant echo, but an active force reaching across the years. She nodded slowly, a mixture of apprehension and resolve settling over her. "Come in, Craddock," she said, stepping aside. "We have much to discuss, and the night, it seems, is just beginning to unfold its secrets." The rain beat more heavily against the windows as he entered, shaking off his coat and holding the clipping like a key to a door, long sealed. The warmth of the cottage enveloped them, but even inside Miss Marple felt the chill of history brushing against her. The mystery of Jonathan Gray, the affair long hidden, and the echoes of those autumn nights demanded attention once again. As Craddock set the paper on the table, the lamplight glinted off the droplets still clinging to his coat, and she knew with certainty that tonight the past would no longer be left undisturbed. Chapter 2, Shadows of Fairley House. The morning was overcast, the sky a pale sheet of grey that pressed gently upon the rolling fields as Miss Marple made her way toward Fairley House. The carriage rumbled along the narrow lane, its wheels sinking slightly into the damp earth from the previous night's rain. She kept her eyes on the familiar silhouette of the manor as it emerged through the mist, though the sight now struck her with a bitter-sweet pang. Time had not been kind. Where once the stone walls had gleamed with meticulous care, ivy now crept over crumbling corners, and several windows bore the weary marks of neglect. The grandeur of the past remained, but it was fragile, like the memory of a long-forgotten song. Stepping out onto the gravel drive, Miss Marple inhaled the cool air, tinged with the scent of wet leaves and damp earth. The entrance doors, once polished to a golden sheen, hung slightly ajar, and the hinges groaned softly as she pushed them open. The foyer smelled of dust and faint decay, yet beneath it lingered the faint perfume of roses and candles, a whisper from the days when laughter and music had filled these halls. Her heart stirred as she crossed the threshold, recalling the glamour of the Fairley ball, silks rustling, chandeliers glittering, and the soft murmur of voices that had seemed to carry the weight of promise and scandal alike. Miss Marple moved with quiet steps, each footfall a soft echo against the marble floors. She paused before the grand staircase, remembering how she had once watched Jonathan Gray ascend with a polite bow to Lady Fairley, his smile easy and kind, yet somehow edged with a nervous tension. The young tutor had vanished shortly after that night, leaving questions unspoken and hearts unsettled. The manor seemed to hold its breath, as if still waiting for his return, and she felt a chill that was not entirely due to the draughty corridors. She wandered into the ballroom, her gaze sweeping over the once lustrous parquet floor, now dull with age. The tall windows, veiled in tattered curtains, let in muted light that made dust particles drift like tiny spirits in the air. She could almost hear the strains of a waltz, faint and ghostly, as though the music had never truly left. Memories of that night returned, the swirl of gowns, the polite laughter, the undercurrent of secrets hidden behind polite smiles. Every detail, no matter how small, seemed etched into the very walls. Miss Marple stopped near the far corner, where a faded tapestry hung crookedly. She traced the edge of the fabric with her fingers, feeling the bumps and ridges of years gone by. Her thoughts drifted to Jonathan Gray once more, so gentle, so earnest, and yet now only a memory preserved in whispers and old letters. The manor, in all its quiet decay, seemed less a building and more a vessel of remembrance, each room carrying echoes of the people who had walked its floors and the choices they had made. The quiet lingered, like a breath held too long. Miss Marple exhaled slowly, gathering her composure. There was work to be done, not just in recalling the past, but in understanding it. Somewhere within these walls lay the truth, buried beneath time, waiting for her careful eyes to uncover it. Miss Marple's eyes wandered across the ballroom walls, taking in the remnants of grandeur that time had left behind. Her attention settled on a large gilt-framed portrait near the far end of the room, its presence commanding despite the shadows creeping along the corners. It depicted the Fairley family in full regalia, Lord Fairley stately and stern, Lady Fairley delicate and poised, and a cluster of children whose innocent faces beamed with the certainty of their place in the world. Yet one figure, small and yet conspicuous, was missing entirely. The canvas bore a jagged tear where a face should have been, leaving only an empty outline, as if the painting itself had mourned some absence. Miss Marple's breath caught, the familiar pang of curiosity mixing with the ache of memory. She crouched slightly, studying the empty space, noting the faint crease at the edge of the rip, the way the paint around it had darkened with age. There was intention here. This was no accident of time. She traced the edges gently with her fingers, careful not to disturb the fragile canvas. The absence seemed to pulse quietly, a silent question left for the observant eye to ponder. Craddock, who had followed her into the room, cleared his throat softly. "It was Lady Fairley herself who had it removed," he said. His tone carried the weight of old knowledge, mingled with hesitation. "I was told it was to protect someone's memory, though no one was ever quite certain whose." The story faded into whispers long ago, and now. "Well, it seems to matter once more." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze still fixed on the gaping absence. Her mind raced gently through the years, piecing together half-remembered conversations, letters she had glimpsed, and the faint, lingering scent of violets from a long-past summer. She knelt, peering along the bottom edge of the frame, and there, tucked between the moulding and the wall, she found a small pressed violet. Its petals were brittle, delicate with age, yet, unmistakably, the same shape and hue as the one in the letter she had received. She lifted it carefully, holding it against her cheek for a moment, and the past seemed to fold over her once again. The image of Jonathan Gray flashed through her mind, the tutor whose charm had once stirred hearts, now tied irrevocably to the mystery of Lady Fairley's sorrow. What had been hidden behind this empty space? What secret had the lady tried to protect, and for whom? Craddock watched silently, aware that some revelations were best approached with care. Miss Marple stood slowly, violet in hand, and studied the faces still intact on the canvas. Each seemed to bear witness, silently observing the unfolding curiosity, as though the family itself were holding its breath, waiting for recognition. She replaced the violet carefully on the ledge beneath the portrait, letting her mind absorb the implications, the torn face, the careful removal, the hidden flower. It was a symbol, a fragment of truth preserved by a woman determined to shield it from the world. Yet symbols were not secrets forever. They waited for attentive eyes to uncover their meaning. Miss Marple straightened, letting the light of the ballroom fall across her thoughtful face. The echoes of laughter, music, and whispered scandal seemed to stir faintly in the corners of the room, as though acknowledging that someone had returned to see, truly see, what history had tried to conceal. Somewhere, behind the layers of paint, paper, and memory, the answer waited, quietly, patient, ready to be revealed. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Village. The aroma of freshly brewed tea filled the snug parlour of Miss Marple's cottage as she sat across from Mrs. Bantry, who had arrived promptly with her usual brisk energy and a hat slightly askew from the drizzle outside. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the floral wallpaper and lace-trimmed curtains. On the small table between them, a delicate china teapot steamed, its companion cups waiting patiently for the first sip of comfort. Mrs. Bantry wasted no time in pouring, humming softly to herself as she balanced a small plate of shortbread. "There's a chill in the air tonight," she said, "though nothing like the frost we had last winter. Still, you can feel the village settling down, don't you think?" Miss Marple lifted her cup with a faint smile, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "Yes, it is quiet for now. Though in St. Mary Mead, quiet never lasts very long." Her eyes twinkled at Mrs. Bantry's frown of mild curiosity. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Speaking of which, I heard something rather odd this morning. Mrs. Hargreaves, you know, the florist? She says she saw a stranger lingering near Fairley House, asked questions about the estate. About, well, things that one shouldn't really ask of a stranger." Miss Marple's gaze lifted, calm but attentive. "A stranger, you say?" "Yes. Tall fellow, neatly dressed, though there was something peculiar about him. Not quite the usual visitor one might expect." Mrs. Bantry's voice softened, almost playful. "It reminded me of the young men who used to show up at the garden parties back in the day. You know, the sort who charm a lady with a smile, then vanish into the night." Miss Marple allowed herself a slight smile, but felt the familiar tug of unease. A visitor at Fairley House was no small matter, especially when old secrets might still linger in the walls and corridors of that forgotten estate. She sipped her tea, letting its warmth anchor her thoughts as images of Jonathan Gray, Lady Fairley, and the whispered scandals of her youth began to drift forward once more. Mrs. Bantry, sensing a shift in the conversation, tilted her head. "Do you remember that dreadful ball, the Fairley Ball, many years ago? My, what a night that was! So much laughter, and yet so many sharp little whispers behind fans and gloves. It all seemed so innocent, and yet, well, one could never truly tell, could one?" "No," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze far away. "One never truly tells. Appearances often hide more than they reveal." Her voice carried the weight of memory, yet it was gentle, comforting even, as if acknowledging that the past could only be approached carefully. Mrs. Bantry leaned back in her chair, allowing a small chuckle. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in remembering a few old stories, especially when we can laugh at them now." She gestured to the steaming cups. "Though I admit, this visitor at Fairley House does make me wonder. There's always some mischief brewing, even when one hopes it is merely imagination." Miss Marple's eyes, calm and observing, lifted toward the window, watching the rain streaking down in silver threads. Somewhere beyond that mist, someone moved with purpose, a stranger with questions and intent. The past was whispering again, and even in the warmth of familiar tea and friendship, its echo could not be ignored. She set down her cup deliberately. Curious indeed. And perhaps, Mrs. Bantry, it is the very ordinary chatter of the village that often holds the most extraordinary clues. The drizzle had lightened to a soft mist as Miss Marple left her cottage, wrapped in her woolen shawl, making her way toward the churchyard at the edge of the village. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, and the low hum of distant bells echoed faintly across the quiet fields. She walked slowly, letting her mind wander among the memories that had resurfaced since the letter arrived, yet remaining alert to the village paths she knew so well. As she approached the gate, her eyes caught a solitary figure kneeling by an old gravestone. The man moved with a careful reverence, placing delicate violets atop the weathered stone. Even from a distance, Miss Marple recognized the tenderness in his gesture, the deliberate care, as though each flower carried weight beyond mere decoration. The stone was worn and moss-covered, the letters faint but legible. J.G. Her heart paused for a moment. The initials belonged unmistakably to Jonathan Gray. A shiver ran through her, not of fear, but of remembrance, the long suppressed pang of that summer evening, of young hopes and whispered confidences that had seemed so distant until now. The man's presence, the violets, the quiet ritual, everything about it breathed life into a story thought long concluded, stirring shadows of emotion she had tucked away carefully all these years. Miss Marple took a step forward, intending to speak, to perhaps offer a gentle word or a nod of recognition. But before she could close the distance, he rose swiftly, as if sensing her approach, and disappeared into the thin veil of morning mist. The sound of his footsteps faded into the soft rustle of leaves, leaving the gravestone, the violets, and her sudden, aching memories behind. She knelt by the stone, placing a hand lightly on the cold, uneven surface. Jonathan Gray, so young, so full of promise, and yet so shadowed by mystery. A memory surfaced sharply, the rumours, long whispered and lightly dismissed, that his heart had belonged not to the girls of the village, as polite society had assumed, but to Lady Fairley herself. Their supposed secret, cloaked in silks and candlelight, had been the subject of cautious glances and half-concealed murmurs, yet no confirmation had ever been offered, and no one had dared speak it aloud. The violets remained, fragile and vivid against the grey stone, and Miss Marple felt a sudden, poignant connection between the flowers and the story she had almost forgotten. Each petal seemed to carry a message, a fragment of the emotions left unspoken, a symbol of love and regret intertwined. The brief glimpse of the stranger, his quiet homage, had opened a door to a past that was far from settled, reminding her that even decades later, human hearts and hidden truths could ripple outward, touching the present in unexpected ways. She rose slowly, brushing leaves from her skirts, and looked toward the path he had taken. The mist swallowed his figure, leaving only questions and half-formed thoughts in its wake. Yet even in that absence, the message remained clear. Love, secrecy, and consequence were still very much alive in the echoes of that long-ago night. Miss Marple drew a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs, grounding her in the moment while allowing the past to settle around her like a gentle cloak. She would need to tread carefully to untangle memory from reality, for the threads of Jonathan Gray's story were tangled with courage, longing, and, perhaps, the faint trace of scandal. And as the rain began to fall more steadily again, she knew that the affair once whispered behind candlelight would not remain silent much longer. Chapter 4. The Secret Room. The heavy wooden door to the east wing groaned in protest as Miss Marple pushed it open, the sound echoing faintly through the quiet halls of Fairley House. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of pale light that filtered through grimy windows, settling on faded carpets and the worn edges of portraits long ignored. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and neglect, a mixture of history and secrets clinging to the walls. Each step she took stirred a whisper of the past, the gentle echo of voices long vanished yet somehow present. Craddock, standing just behind her, nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgment of her careful composure.
"It's as we thought," he murmured.
Nothing moved here in years, save for perhaps the wind and the occasional curious mouse. Miss Marple smiled faintly, appreciating his restrained attention to detail. She had always found Craddock's steadiness comforting, a steady anchor amidst the uncertain tides of history. The room was lined with towering bookshelves, their volumes thick with dust and the weight of time. Leather-bound tomes, some with cracked spines, leaned precariously against one another, and yellowed papers slipped occasionally from their confines. Miss Marple ran her fingers lightly along the shelves, tracing the faded titles and noting the curious assortment of diaries, ledgers, and letters scattered haphazardly. The quiet of the east wing seemed alive, each object a potential clue, each shadow a whisper. At the far end of the room, a trunk lay partially hidden beneath a heavy drape. Its brass fittings gleamed faintly through the grime, and the lock remained intact, untouched by the passing decades. Miss Marple approached it with deliberate caution, her senses alert to every detail. She knelt, inspecting the surface, the latch, the scratches and scuffs that hinted at long-forgotten handling. Beside it, a pile of faded letters caught her eye. Each envelope was brittle, the paper soft and delicate to the touch. One envelope, however, bore a familiar mark, a violet seal. Pressed with care, identical to the one in the letter that had arrived earlier, and to the violet she had found in the torn portrait. Miss Marple lifted it carefully, inhaling the faint fragrance that lingered, a subtle reminder of the garden blooms of summers long past. She ran her fingers along the edges, feeling the texture of the paper and the imprint of the seal, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Someone had left a deliberate breadcrumb, a message preserved in silence and patience. The trunk remained silent and imposing, promising answers while guarding them fiercely. Miss Marple circled it slowly, her eyes studying every hinge, every carved detail of its worn exterior. What had been hidden inside? Letters alone could hold one kind of secret, but a trunk suggested something more tangible, something deliberately concealed, perhaps proof or memory, or the final piece of a story that had begun decades ago. Craddock watched her movements with quiet respect. He understood the patience required for such discovery, the careful observation that turned dust and shadows into revelation. Miss Marple pressed her hand gently against the trunk, feeling its cool surface, imagining the hands that had touched it years ago, wondering what sorrow or regret had been tucked within its confines. The east wing seemed to settle around them, the dust and shadows waiting in anticipation. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint sigh of the wind through broken windows seemed to urge her onward. The past was tangible here, held in objects and symbols, waiting to be understood. Miss Marple knew with the quiet certainty that had guided her many times before, that this trunk and the letters surrounding it would reveal truths long hidden, truths that could reshape her understanding of Jonathan Gray, Lady Fairley, and the choices that had shadowed their lives. Miss Marple lifted the trunk lid with steady hands, the hinges creaking under the weight of years and secrets. Inside, among folded garments yellowed with age and a scattering of old correspondence, lay a leather-bound diary. Its cover was worn, the edges softened from handling, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the pages, a quiet testament to the lady who had once held it close. With deliberate care, Miss Marple removed it and sat cross-legged on the floor, placing the diary in her lap as Craddock looked on silently. Understanding that some discoveries required intimacy with the past, opening the diary, Miss Marple's eyes fell first upon the meticulous handwriting of Lady Fairley. The ink had faded to a warm brown, yet every word remained legible, a window into thoughts kept private for decades. The first entries described ordinary days, the careful tending of gardens, the polite entertainments of the manor, and the weight of expectation borne with grace. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple could sense the quiet tension, the small undercurrents of worry that hinted at troubles not shared with servants or friends. Turning the pages, the entries grew darker, the tone weighted with sorrow and hesitation. Lady Fairlie wrote of sleepless nights and whispered regrets, of moments when a glance from Jonathan Gray had caused her heart to stir in ways propriety would never condone. His name appeared repeatedly, inked with the tremor of emotion and guilt. Miss Marple's fingers lingered over the words, tracing the loops of letters that spoke of forbidden affection, of loyalty tested, and of the fear that such feelings could never see the light of day. There were passages that hinted at secrets carefully guarded, promises made, decisions taken quietly, and the knowledge that some actions might haunt those left behind. The diary revealed a heart torn between desire and duty, a mind weighed down by what had been seen and what had been left unsaid. Miss Marple read each line with a gentle patience, sensing the careful rhythm of a woman writing not for the world, but for herself, a confessor to the pages, a witness to her own conscience. The entries became more fragmented toward the end. The lines hurried, the sentences uneven. One in particular drew Miss Marple's attention, the words trailing off mid-thought, a sudden break in the narrative that suggested interruption. She paused, holding her breath as her eyes took in the abrupt ending. It was as if the writer had been silenced or had chosen, at the last moment, to withhold the final revelation. The question pressed inescapably. Had Lady Fairlie confessed something to these pages that could no longer be read, or had circumstances beyond her control left the story unfinished? Miss Marple closed the diary slowly, allowing the weight of its contents to settle around her. Craddock, sensing the depth of the moment, refrained from comment, understanding that discovery sometimes demanded silence. The room seemed quieter, as though the walls themselves absorbed the gravity of emotions laid bare on those fragile, ink-stained sheets. The violet seal from the envelope tucked in the trunk now felt symbolic, a link between the letter she had received and the intimate thoughts of Lady Fairlie. Each page of the diary was a testament to human frailty, to love constrained by expectation, and to the shadows cast by choices made in secrecy. Jonathan Gray's name, repeated with yearning and regret, connected the threads of past and present, calling Miss Marple to reconcile memory with mystery. She rose slowly, holding the diary with care, the quiet hum of the east wing settling around her like a whispered sigh. Somewhere within these words lay the truth, delicate and painful, waiting for understanding. The final entry's abrupt halt was a question poised in silence, and Miss Marple knew that the answers, hidden in gestures, letters, and remnants of life long past, would demand careful attention and a steady hand. Chapter 5. The Return of the Past. The morning air carried a crispness that hinted at the approaching winter, as Miss Marple made her way down the familiar lanes of St. Mary Mead, the cobblestones damp with overnight mist. She had set her sights on two old acquaintances whose recollections might shed light on the shadows of Fairlie House. Colonel Melrose, a man whose sharp mind had once kept the village in orderly awe, and Reverend Clement, whose gentle demeanour masked an acute perception of human nature. Both had witnessed the days of the Fairlie ball and the events that followed, and both had memories coloured by personal interpretation. Her first call was to Colonel Melrose, who welcomed her into a sitting-room lined with shelves of military books and medals that gleamed faintly in the morning light. He was seated in his favourite armchair, the leather worn with years of use, a cup of tea at hand. Miss Marple greeted him warmly, and after brief pleasantries, she steered the conversation gently toward the past. "You remember the Fairlie ball, Colonel?" she asked, her tone soft, inviting. He adjusted his spectacles and nodded slowly, eyes narrowing as the memories surfaced. "Yes, indeed. A grand affair, outwardly impeccable, of course. But underneath, well, there was tension, Miss Marple. I recall whispers of something between Jonathan Gray and Lady Fairley.
Love, perhaps, or something equally forbidden. I'd be lying if I said I didn't suspect more than one person's honor was at stake that night. He sipped his tea thoughtfully,
The faint clink of porcelain punctuating the weight of his words. Miss Marple listened intently, nodding as his recollection painted one side of a multifaceted picture. There was admiration in his memory, but also a lingering suspicion of impropriety. His version emphasized the daring, the danger, and the potential for scandal, painting Gray as a man whose charm had left consequences in its wake. Later that afternoon, she visited Reverend Clement, who greeted her with a warm, wry smile. His parlour smelled faintly of polished wood and old books, and he offered her a seat by the window where the light fell soft upon the lace curtains. "Miss Marple," he said, "you look like someone about to untangle a knot long thought too tight." "I hope only to understand," she replied, carefully. "I seek the recollections of those who saw the events unfold firsthand." The Reverend's eyes twinkled as he leaned back. "Ah, I remember the young tutor well. Jonathan Gray was a quiet sort, thoughtful, devoted."
And Lady Fairley?
Well, she carried the weight of propriety heavily, but I believe she loved him, though perhaps not without fear. There were letters, hints, subtle confidences, enough to suggest that their hearts were entangled, even if their actions were constrained. Some spoke of blackmail, though I never could prove it.
Love and betrayal often walk together, Miss Marple. Miss Marple absorbed every detail,
Noting the contrasts between Colonel Melrose's perception and the Reverend's. Both remembered the affair, yet each remembered differently. One saw danger, the other subtle devotion. One saw scandal, the other shadowed devotion complicated by fear. The truth, she realized, might lie not in the certainty of one memory, but in the delicate interplay between them. In the spaces between recollections, as she prepared to leave, Reverend Clement added, almost as an afterthought, "Be cautious with what you uncover. Memories can be kind, cruel, and misleading all at once. What you seek may not be found in the letters or diaries alone, but in the quiet acknowledgments of those who remain to tell the tale." Miss Marple nodded, the warmth of friendship tempered by careful consideration. Each visit had added threads to a tapestry of human complexity, weaving together love, regret, fear, and loyalty. She stepped back into the crisp afternoon, the village streets familiar yet suddenly full of subtle tension. Somewhere within these recollections, the truth waited patiently, hidden in plain sight between heart's words and decades-old secrets. By late afternoon, the village was abuzz with news that unsettled even the most composed residents. Word had spread quickly. The stranger seen by the churchyard, the man who had left violets on Jonathan Gray's grave, had been discovered lifeless near the pond at the edge of the village. Whispers carried from doorstep to doorstep, their tones a mixture of fear, speculation, and fascination. Even in the familiar calm of St. Mary Mead, the quiet order of the day seemed fractured, as though history had reached forward to demand attention. Miss Marple received the news through a hurried knock at her door. Craddock stood outside, coat damp from the light rain, his expression tense yet measured. In his hand he held a small, folded envelope, the same violet seal adorning it as those from Fairley House in the diary. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, stepping inside, "it appears the past is no longer content to remain in memory."
"This man, he's dead."
And in his hand he clutched this. He handed her the envelope, careful to maintain its integrity, as if the paper itself carried the weight of mystery. She accepted it with calm precision, her mind threading together the familiar violet motif, the events of decades past, and the present tragedy. The stranger's death was not merely an incident. It was a signal, a stark echo of unresolved histories and the faintest hint of repeating patterns she had feared. The pond, usually serene, now seemed ominous in her imagination, its placid surface holding a reflection not only of the village, but of secrets long submerged. Craddock lowered his voice, leaning in slightly. He appeared to be searching, perhaps uncovering something, and now, We are left with questions rather than answers. I fear we may be witnessing a repetition of what occurred all those years ago at Fairley House. Someone, perhaps more than one, is determined that certain truths should remain buried. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, thoughtful but not alarmed. The connections were subtle but unmistakable. The violets, the churchyard, the abandoned gravestone, and now a second death. All threads led back to Jonathan Gray, Lady Fairley, and the secrets that had remained dormant for decades. The layers of history were thick, yet each revealed a pattern, a sequence of human emotion and consequence waiting to be understood. She walked to the window, gazing out at the mist settling across the village pond, the reeds swaying gently despite the grim news. The image was serene, almost comforting, yet she knew that beneath that placid surface, currents of sorrow, love, and perhaps vengeance were at play. Someone had acted with purpose, and the violets were no mere ornament. They were a signature, a message, and a key to the puzzle she was only beginning to unravel. Craddock's voice drew her back from her reverie. "Miss Marple, I would value your insight. The villagers are unsettled, and frankly I cannot see the full picture alone. Your perspective has solved far more than any official inquiry." She nodded, a quiet determination settling over her. The past had claimed another victim, and the threads of mystery were tightening around her, as if urging her to uncover what had been left incomplete for so long. Miss Marple knew that the answers would not be simple, nor entirely comforting, yet she felt the familiar spark of curiosity and resolve. Somewhere between the letters, the diaries, and the echoes of memory, the truth awaited, its shadow stretching into the present, demanding attention, and perhaps offering resolution. Chapter 6. The Hidden Confession. The room was quiet except for the faint flicker of candlelight, which cast warm, trembling shadows across the walls, and the worn pages of Lady Fairley's diary. Miss Marple sat at a small desk near the window, the diary open before her, and a magnifying glass in hand. She moved slowly, carefully, allowing her eyes to adjust to the soft glow, tracing the faint strokes of the final, unfinished entry. Every word was deliberate, yet something about the abruptness at the end had suggested to her, even before this moment, that more remained hidden. She leaned closer, tilting the page beneath the candle flame, noting the way the ink darkened slightly with heat. With the patience she had honed over decades of quiet observation, Miss Marple began to discern a pattern, a faint residue along certain letters, barely visible in ordinary light, as though someone had written a secret meant to be revealed only to the most attentive of readers. Her pulse quickened softly, not with fear, but with the thrill of discovery. Slowly, methodically, she followed the faint lines, the invisible script revealing itself like a whisper emerging from a shadowed corridor. The words were brief yet precise. "He died for love, but not by my hand." Miss Marple read them twice, letting their meaning sink in. It was a revelation that carried both weight and relief. Lady Fairley had not caused Jonathan Gray's death, and yet her connection to the events of that time had been so intimate, so entangled with emotion, that suspicion could have easily fallen upon her. The diary, once a repository of guilt and yearning, now offered clarity, though it was tinged with sorrow. Miss Marple's fingers lingered on the page, feeling the texture of the paper and the subtle indentation of each letter. The phrase seemed to hum with the complexity of human morality, love intertwined with consequence, innocence paired with unintended tragedy. She understood immediately that this was not a confession of crime, but a confession of knowledge, a careful acknowledgement of fate's cruel hand. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the candlelight wash over her face. The invisible ink had been a final act of communication, a message preserved beyond the reach of casual readers, meant for those patient enough to seek the truth. The violet seal, the pressed flowers, the torn portrait, they all now connected with this final declaration, a network of symbols and signs that bridged decades. Miss Marple felt the quiet satisfaction of having unearthed what had been meticulously hidden, while simultaneously sensing the weight of its implications. Craddock, who had been watching her quietly from the doorway, stepped closer, his expression a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "Remarkable," he murmured. "To think someone would go to such lengths to clarify their conscience after all these years." Miss Marple nodded without speaking, carefully closing the diary and placing it on the desk. She allowed herself a small, reflective smile, recognizing the delicate balance between human error and intent. The past had been preserved with care, and yet even in that preservation, the truth had managed to whisper itself gently into the present. The candle flickered one last time before settling into a steady glow, illuminating the room with a comforting warmth. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind weaving together the threads of letters, diaries, violets, and memories. Jonathan Gray's death had been tragic, but now it was framed not by malice but by circumstance and the enduring complexity of human heart. In that quiet, flickering light, she understood the profound innocence and the quiet devastation held within Lady Fairlie's final message. Miss Marple returned to the village church as twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, the mist curling around gravestones and the ancient yew trees casting long, dark shadows across the stone path. The church stood quiet, the scent of damp wood and candle wax mingling in the cool evening air. She paused for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through stained glass windows before approaching the massive organ at the far end of the nave. Something about the space felt deliberate, almost expectant, as though it, too, had waited decades for discovery. The organ's keys gleamed faintly in the soft light, their ivory surfaces worn from years of careful play. Miss Marple knelt beside it, inspecting the pedals and the small compartments tucked beneath the instrument. Her fingers traced every seam and hinge with practiced patience, and then she noticed a tiny catch hidden near the baseboard, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. With gentle pressure, the panel sprang open, revealing a shallow cavity. Inside lay a small, velvet-lined box, its surface coated in a thin layer of dust, as if untouched for decades. Heart quickening with quiet anticipation, she lifted the lid. Within lay a delicate brooch shaped like a violet blossom, its petals formed from amethyst and tiny diamonds catching the fading light. It was unmistakably the same brooch Lady Fairlie had once worn, the one referenced in the diary and the letters. Miss Marple handled it carefully, marvelling at its exquisite craftsmanship and the hidden weight it carried, not merely of jewels, but of memory, secrecy, and long-buried emotion. She turned it over, inspecting the back for signs of wear. Her eyes widened slightly as she noticed faint fingerprints smudged across the clasp. They were not her own, nor anyone else's she could immediately recognize. Craddock, who had followed her into the quiet nave, leaned in to observe.
"Any idea?"
he asked, curiosity lacing his tone. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the subtle impressions.
"Yes," she murmured softly. "These belong to a man."
"Someone close to Lady Fairlie." "Her husband, I believe." The realization settled over the room like a slow dawn. The brooch, hidden for decades, bore a silent witness to actions and intentions that had remained concealed, linking a family member directly to the chain of secrets surrounding Jonathan Gray and the events of the Fairlie ball. The implications were delicate, yet unmistakable. Love, betrayal, and consequence had not only resided in the affairs of Lady Fairlie and her young tutor, they had extended into the very heart of the family, shaping decisions, concealments, and tragedies. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to consider the magnitude of the discovery. The brooch was a key, a tangible connection between emotion and action, evidence that illuminated a previously shadowed corner of the story. She carefully replaced the brooch in its velvet resting place, closing the hidden compartment and smoothing the panel back into place. Craddock observed her movements, silently acknowledging the significance of this finding. Outside, the mist thickened, wrapping the churchyard in gentle mystery,
as if the village itself held its breath, waiting for the full picture to emerge. Miss Marple rose slowly,
the brooch and its story now firmly in her mind. Every symbol, every letter, every carefully hidden object had built toward this moment, and she could sense the final pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. The innocent yet damning fingerprints told a story of human complexity, of choices made in love, fear, and loyalty, and she understood that the true culprit, or at least the silent enabler, had been closer than anyone had realized. With a soft sigh, she allowed herself a quiet smile. The past, once shrouded in shadows, was steadily revealing its truths. Chapter 7. The Night of the Truth. The evening had fallen softly over Fairleigh House, the last light of day drifting through tall, dust-laden windows and casting long, golden shadows across the once grand halls. Miss Marple, Craddock, and a small gathering of villagers had convened in the ballroom, its faded grandeur lending the room an air of solemn expectation. The fire in the hearth crackled quietly, sending sparks of warmth across the floor, mingling with the soft murmur of conversation as old friends and neighbours took their seats. The atmosphere was intimate yet charged with anticipation, a delicate balance between comfort and the thrill of impending revelation. Miss Marple stood near the centre of the room, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Her gaze swept across the faces around her, noting the mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and trust. "We are here," she began softly, "to revisit the night that has lingered quietly in memory for far too long. We seek understanding, not judgment, and perhaps in doing so, we may restore the peace that has been unsettled by silence." Her words, measured and gentle, seemed to hush the murmurs, drawing all attention toward her. Craddock nodded, standing beside her, his hands clasped in front of him. "Miss Marple has been kind enough to guide us through recollections, letters, and discoveries that have surfaced. Tonight, we attempt to reconstruct that evening, not as accusation, but as clarity." Miss Marple's eyes softened as she began. The Fairleigh ball was, on the surface, a night of splendour, music, dancing, and laughter. Yet beneath the silk gowns and candlelight, there existed moments unseen, intentions unspoken, and choices that would ripple through time. She paused, letting her words settle among the listeners, each person absorbing the weight of memory and the gentle tension that accompanied it. She guided them slowly through the evening, recounting Lady Fairleigh's careful movements, Jonathan Gray's quiet attentions, and the subtle gestures that betrayed affection and worry. Every detail was deliberate, the placement of a letter on a side table, the whispered conversation in the library, the momentary glances exchanged across the ballroom. Miss Marple's voice was soft but precise, weaving a tapestry of events that made the night vivid once more, while never losing the comforting cadence of storytelling that made listeners lean in without fear. Villagers murmured softly as memories surfaced, aligning with her narrative in small confirmations and gentle corrections. Each recollection, however minor, became a thread in the larger picture, illuminating hidden corners of that long-ago night. The combination of her narration and their memories created a living reconstruction, a bridge between past and present that made the room feel alive with history, emotion, and the delicate suspense of discovery. As she spoke of the moments leading to Jonathan Gray's disappearance, Miss Marple's tone shifted subtly, more focused, more intent, yet remained calm and unhurried. The details built carefully, connecting gestures, letters, and hidden objects in a way that allowed each listener to feel the emerging clarity without the tension becoming overwhelming. Every pause, every emphasis was designed to draw attention gently, as though inviting the truth to step forward at its own measured pace. By the time she concluded this first account, the room was quiet, each person holding the fragile image of that night in their mind. The puzzle pieces had begun to fit together, forming patterns that hinted at both innocence and hidden consequence. The warmth of the fire, the gentle comfort of shared memory, and the quiet curiosity of discovery created an atmosphere in which revelation could emerge softly, yet undeniably. Miss Marple looked around, her eyes meeting each listener's gaze, and for the first time a subtle sense of resolution seemed possible. Miss Marple held the worn ledger carefully in her hands, the leather cover soft with age and the edges frayed from years of handling. Inside, tucked between pages of financial accounts and routine parish notes, she had discovered a folded letter, its paper yellowed and delicate. The seal, long faded, bore the unmistakable emblem of the Fairley family. She unfolded it slowly, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she began to read, the words of Lord Fairley themselves reaching across time with quiet force. "My hand trembles as I write this," the letter began in precise, careful script, "for what I must confess cannot be undone, nor fully absolved by any earthly means. Many years ago, in a moment of blind jealousy, I struck Jonathan Gray. I did not intend death, yet in my rage I acted with a force that ended a life I had no right to take.
Fear overtook me, and I buried the truth as best I could, leaving blame to history and rumour.
I have carried this burden silently, knowing that confession to the living would achieve nothing but scandal and despair. I write now only to unburden my soul before my own death, to leave some acknowledgement of guilt."
Even if justice comes too late, Miss Marple's breath caught.
A gentle hush settling over the room as Craddock and the assembled villagers listened silently. The words were both shocking and quietly sorrowful, a mixture of remorse and explanation that cast decades of mystery in a new light. The man who had seemed so distant, so reserved in memory, was revealed as a figure shaped by intense human emotion, fear, jealousy, and ultimately regret. She continued reading, her eyes tracing every line. Lord Fairley described the moments after the incident with painful honesty, the panic, the hurried concealment of evidence, and the heavy weight of secrecy that had dictated every decision thereafter. He wrote of Jonathan Gray's unfulfilled potential, the young man's charm and intelligence, and the unintended consequences that rippled outward to Lady Fairley, the estate, and the village itself. The confession was both intimate and formal, a delicate weaving of truth and reflection. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the meaning of the letter settle around her like a quiet fog. The past, she realized, had been shaped not by malice alone, but by human weakness and flawed judgment. Jonathan Gray's death had been tragic, yes, but it had been accidental, a collision of passion and circumstance rather than deliberate cruelty. The letter offered clarity, resolution, and perhaps a measure of forgiveness withheld too long from the man who had lived with the secret until his death. Craddock stepped forward, his voice low yet steady. "So the mystery is solved," he said, a mixture of relief and melancholy in his tone. The stranger at the church, the hidden letters, the violets, all pieces of a story that needed patience and careful observation to reveal. Miss Marple nodded, carefully placing the letter back in the ledger. "Indeed, justice in the form of understanding may be delayed, but it is not denied. The past has spoken, and while it cannot be altered, it can now be acknowledged with truth finally prevailing over rumour and speculation." The villagers remained silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of the confession. There was no triumphant exclamation, no sudden revelation of villainy. Instead, a calm recognition that human life is rarely simple, that love, jealousy, and error can entwine to create consequences far beyond a single moment. In that quiet, the room felt warmer, lighter, as though acknowledging the truth had lifted a burden that had lingered for generations. Miss Marple looked around at the assembled faces, her expression gentle but resolute. The story, long shrouded in shadow, had finally emerged into the light, leaving sorrow behind, but also a measure of peace. The truth had been found, and though delayed, justice of a certain kind, honest, reflective, and deeply human, had been served. Chapter 8. The Violet's Meaning. The morning air was crisp. the drizzle having faded into a gentle mist that hovered over the village churchyard. Miss Marple approached the gravestone marked J.G., her steps slow and deliberate across the dew-slick grass. The world felt hushed, as if it too had paused to acknowledge the resolution of a story long suspended between memory and mystery. She carried in her hand a single violet, its delicate petals glistening with moisture, a quiet symbol that had threaded through the entire saga, from letters and diaries to hidden brooches and confessions. Kneeling by the grave, she placed the violet gently upon the stone. It was not an offering of sorrow or accusation, but one of understanding and forgiveness. Jonathan Gray's story, once shrouded in secrecy and untold love, had finally been made whole through truth and careful reflection. The past, with all its human complexity,
had been acknowledged, and in this simple act,
Miss Marple felt a sense of calm settle over her, a balm for decades of hidden tension. She lingered for a moment, eyes tracing the contours of the weathered stone, feeling the quiet presence of the man who had captured hearts and carried secrets too heavy for a young life to bear. The violets were a bridge between eras, a tangible link connecting memory with the present, grief with acceptance. The symbolism was subtle yet profound, love and loss, sorrow and forgiveness, intertwined in a gesture both humble and meaningful. The mist began to lift slowly, sunlight breaking through clouds to touch the gravestones with warm, golden light. Shadows retreated as the day asserted its gentle clarity, and Miss Marple allowed herself to breathe deeply, feeling the serenity of the moment seep into her bones. The mystery had been resolved, the threads of human emotion carefully untangled, and the village itself seemed to exhale in relief, as though the air carried away lingering whispers of scandal and uncertainty. Craddock, arriving quietly behind her, observed the scene with respectful distance. "You've brought closure," he said softly.
not merely to the mystery, but to the emotions entwined with it.
"The village, the family, all of us. We can move forward now." Miss Marple nodded, a small smile gracing her lips. "Closure is not about punishment or blame, Inspector, but about understanding. Recognizing the full weight of human hearts and choices allows us to leave the past where it belongs, acknowledged, but no longer burdensome." She paused, allowing her gaze to sweep over the surrounding graves, the subtle glimmer of sunlight dancing across wet leaves, the gentle sway of newly freed branches in the breeze. She stood slowly, her hand brushing faintly over the violet before letting it rest untouched. The gesture completed, it felt as though she had left a piece of compassion behind, a silent acknowledgement that mistakes, sorrow, and secrets are threads woven into the fabric of life, and that forgiveness, quiet and unassuming, is sometimes the most powerful conclusion of all. Miss Marple walked back down the winding path toward the village, the sunlight warming her shoulders and illuminating the familiar cobbled lanes. The churchyard behind her seemed transformed, lighter and more at peace, its shadows softened, its stories no longer suspended between question marks and fear. In that moment, the world felt calm, the suspense of the past replaced by gentle reflection,
leaving space for memory, understanding,
and quiet contentment. Back in the warm comfort of her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her favourite armchair by the fire. The flames danced softly in the hearth, casting a gentle glow across the familiar walls lined with books, framed photographs, and knickknacks collected over the years. Outside, the rain had passed, leaving the garden glistening with drops of moisture that caught the fading light. She poured herself a cup of tea, the steam curling upward in delicate spirals, carrying with it the soothing scent of chamomile and mint, the diary, the letters, the violet, and even the brooch. All the threads of the mystery lay on the table beside her, a tangible reminder of the past she had carefully untangled. Yet, even as the puzzle had been resolved, she understood that some stories do not end neatly. They linger in memory, in small gestures, in the faint traces left on a gravestone or a pressed flower. Some affairs, she reflected, are not matters of romance alone. They are affairs of conscience, loyalty, and regret. Decisions made in the quiet of the heart can ripple outward, shaping lives and leaving marks unseen yet deeply felt. She picked up her knitting, the rhythm of the needles soothing, familiar. The soft click and slide of yarn offered a quiet counterpoint to the intensity of reflection. Her mind wandered gently over the faces of those involved, the young tutor whose life had been cut tragically short, Lady Fairley, burdened by secrets and guilt, Lord Fairley, whose jealousy had wrought unintended consequences, and the villagers who had lived with echoes of the past without full understanding. Each had acted according to human impulses, flawed yet understandable, and in recognizing this, Miss Marple felt a sense of peace. Outside, the sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the village. The streets were calm, the churchyard serene, and the weight of years seemed to settle softly into quiet harmony. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth spread through her, grounding her in the present, even as her thoughts revisited the past. The mysteries she solved were more than puzzles. They were glimpses into the human heart, intricate and often contradictory, capable of both error and redemption. She allowed herself a small, reflective smile, thinking of the violet she had left on Jonathan Gray's grave. Not a gesture of guilt, nor of accusation, but of understanding. The past, with all its shadows and whispers, had been acknowledged, and now it could rest. In her own way, she had honored the complexities of life, the choices and missteps that shape memory, and the enduring lessons of empathy and patience. As she returned to her knitting, the room grew quiet save for the gentle hum of the fire and the soft scratch of needles on wool. Outside, the village settled into evening, the sun dipping lower, painting the sky in gentle hues of amber and rose. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she looked out the window, her heart carrying both the weight and the release of understanding. The memory of what had transpired, pain, love, mistakes, and courage, would remain with her always, a quiet testament to the depth of human experience. The cottage seemed to exhale with her, a sanctuary of reflection and comfort. The mysteries were resolved, the secrets laid bare, and yet the echoes lingered, not as burdens, but as reminders of the delicate interplay between choice, consequence, and compassion. In the warm, quiet space of her home, Miss Marple resumed her gentle routine, knitting and sipping tea, letting the story fold softly into memory, leaving the heart full, the mind at ease, and the listener, too,
wrapped in the serene closure of a tale well told. And to you,
dear listener, thank you for joining this gentle journey through memory, mystery, and the delicate threads of human hearts. Consider this. What would you have done if a secret from your past came knocking? The story rests now, but the questions linger, and perhaps in them we find both reflection and quiet wonder. Until we meet again, may your evenings be calm, your mind curious, and your heart ever attentive.